Whether you're just getting started on your journey with watercolor and you're looking to practice essential techniques, or you're further ahead and you're looking for a fun, summer-inspired tutorial to try, this one is for you. In today's tutorial, I am taking you through my entire process for these 3 popsicle illustrations, starting with how I create my preliminary pencil sketch stemming from basic shapes, and then how I move on to doing my layering process with watercolor for believable results. This is a great opportunity to practice both your color mixing as well as creating soft wet-on-wet effects. If you'd like my outline sketch so that you can trace over that and skip over the freehand sketching process and get right to the painting, I'll leave a link down below in the description box where you can go ahead and grab that. All right, with all that said, let's jump in. Let's go ahead and get started with our preliminary outline sketches for these 3 popsicles. I am using an HB pencil and I'm going to be drawing very, very lightly because I don't want my pencil to show through my translucent paint at the end, and I also want to be able to erase my mistakes easily because I'm going to be drawing these freehand. And of course, I don't want to scratch or damage my watercolor paper because once you scratch or damage your watercolor paper, there is no taking that back. What I am doing here is I'm creating my outline sketches for these 3 popsicles, and really I'm using the same ideas, the same key principles that I use whenever I'm creating any sort of outline sketch, whenever I'm drawing anything at all. And these are things that I've shared in past classes and videos on freehand sketching. I'll make sure to leave a couple of extra resources on freehand sketching tips below for you in case you'd like to check those out. But essentially, I am visualizing these as simple shapes, focusing on largest general shapes first and making my way towards smaller shapes and details once I see that the largest shapes have been successfully achieved. I also help myself by placing tick marks and also straight verticals and straight horizontals whenever I feel they could come in handy. When I am drawing those largest general shapes, I am always visualizing them as blocky geometric forms and kind of tune out any curves and irregular shapes and things like that until after I've placed that large geometric blocky shape on my paper. I am focusing initially on making sure that the proportions are good for that blocky largest shape and making sure that I have it placed effectively in my drawing area before going in and refining any shapes and adding any curves and things like that. And you saw me do just this with this popsicle in the middle that has rounded out corners all throughout. So initially I went in and placed a few tick marks for myself so that I could visualize the space that I'd be drawing this popsicle in and also the size that I would be drawing it in. And then after I had placed some lines for myself, I then created the curves. If you find it helpful, especially with this kind of subject, which is very symmetrical in nature, you could certainly help yourself by placing 2 vertical lines along the left and right side of the popsicle shape, as well as the top and bottom of the popsicle. You can also draw 2 horizontals so that you can make sure that at the end, your shape for your popsicle looks symmetrical if you were to place a line dividing it into left and right halves. Our brain is able to understand straight verticals and straight horizontals a lot more easily than curves and irregular shapes. And by placing these straight verticals or straight horizontals, you're able to have a guideline for yourself right there that is going to enable you to more easily create symmetry whenever needed, but also if you need to compare angles created by the shape or certain alignments, those lines that you have right there can certainly be helpful. With this last one, you can see how I just went right in and drew a long rectangle because I knew that once I had that long rectangle there in the size and in the space that I wanted to be in my drawing area, then all I would have to do is actually erase a couple of those angles created by that blocky shape and turn them into curves. So again, this is a perfect example of how I was first focusing on proportion and location of that element within my drawing area, and then I just refined those curves, and that was about it. All of the other shapes and also the popsicle sticks were added until after the largest shapes had been effectively placed in my drawing area. And right here I'm just doing some final lightening up and removing of excess graphite from my watercolor sheet before getting started with my painting process by just gently tapping my kneaded eraser over my drawings. I painted these popsicles in 2 layers. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be painting the first layer wet on wet in all 3 popsicles. And then we're going to be coming back to create the second layer on all 3 popsicles. Probably we're going to be painting in the cast shadow and also the stick in between those layers, but that is the general idea. For each of these popsicles, we're going to be creating anywhere from 2 to 3 color mixtures. We have to have these color mixtures ready on our color mixing palette because we want to drop in our color while that paper is still wet, okay? So that we can have those nice wet on wet, soft transitions and gradients between our colors. The color mixtures that I'm preparing for this very first popsicle is a lighter green and a darker green. And the 2 colors that I am using for this are my cadmium lemon and my green. I am using my size 6 round brush for my color mixtures, and before jumping into my paint pans, I made sure to prepare my paintbrush bristles by soaking them in my container of water, removing the excess drippage, and then I go into my paint pans and swivel my bristles in my paint and bring out a little bit of paint at a time into my well on my color mixing palette, on and on as needed. So right here on my color mixing palette, you can see how in that circular well right there on the upper left, I am creating my darker green color mixture. So that is going to have more of that green than of my cadmium lemon. And the other one is going to have way more of that cadmium lemon in it than of my green. And I'm going to be testing out these color mixtures on my scrap piece of watercolor paper so that I can make sure that there is a good difference between the 2 greens that I create. I want to make sure that these greens that I create are not too similar, because if they are super similar, when I drop one into the previous layer, which is still wet, there's not going to be a nice gradient. There's not going to be a visible gradient step by step happening between the 2 colors. So make sure that you test your color mixtures out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper to ensure that one looks lighter and one looks darker. I want you to notice how juicy and how saturated my color mixtures are on my color mixing palette. Not only did I make sure that I created enough paint for myself so that I wouldn't run out midway through the painting process, but I also made sure that there's a good amount of color and also some water in my color mixtures. They're nice and juicy. There's plenty of movement going on. If I were to lift my color mixing palette and shift it, tilt it a little bit back and forth, there would be movement in that color mixture. But at the same time, it's not super translucent that I am barely going to be adding any color at all when I drop it into my wet paper. Okay, so with my 2 green color mixtures ready, I then removed all of the green from my paintbrush bristles. I then started doing pre-wetting in this shape for this popsicle on the left. So all I am doing right here is I am taking my time doing some pre-wetting all throughout this popsicle shape using clean water. Whenever I am doing this pre-wetting technique, I like taking my time. I go over everything at least 3 to 4 times and make sure that there is a nice even sheen all throughout this area, and also make sure that you don't have any puddles anywhere, because that can definitely lead to splotchiness and just undesired effects. And if you do have any excess water anywhere, run your bristles over that little puddle and your bristles are going to act like a little absorbent sponge. Just soak up that excess water and then just run your paintbrush bristles over that area one last time to ensure there is an evenness all throughout. And then once you're ready, you can go ahead and start dropping in your color. I'm going to get started with adding in my lightest color of the bunch always. This is what I like doing. I always get started with the lightest color that I prepared for myself for the area on hand, which in this case, it's of course the lighter green that has a lot of yellow in it. So you can see how I place that lighter green sparingly in certain sections, and I left some sections of white paper shining through. I made sure not to go in and cover up the entire shape because I certainly want to make sure that I have some very light translucent areas so that I can give this popsicle dimension. Okay, so once I had a good amount of the lighter green in there, I started dropping in my darker green. And once I felt I had a good amount of color on there, I removed all of the color from my paintbrush bristles, and I went back in with a clean and only slightly damp paintbrush and very, very gently moved that color a little bit just to help that color kind of integrate together a little bit more and create softer transitions. And I even did a little bit of lifting using the clean and only slightly damp bristles of my paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge right along the center there. Here I am doing it again. This is lifting. I highly recommend trying out this technique and practicing it because it will certainly help give your painting dimension when you have accidentally placed way too much paint on your paper and things have gotten a little bit too flat. Right here, I'm taking advantage of the fact that my paper is still wet and workable to drop in some bright yellow blooms. So I just took some saturated color straight from the pan and dropped it in while those greens were still wet. Remember that if you don't plan for areas in which that color is very, very light and translucent, or in which you even have the whiteness of the paper shining through completely unpainted, then it's very likely that your painting is going to look flatter because you are getting rid of those lightest values and those lightest lights, which are definitely needed to make something look a little bit more realistic, more 3D. Okay, so at this point you can see how I have some very light translucent areas, especially along the middle of that popsicle. I have some areas in which I've used a lot of that lighter green that is more on the yellow side, and other areas in which I've used more of the darker green. So I've managed to already develop a nice variety of both translucencies and color all throughout this shape. And at this point, I am using my smaller round brush, this is my size 2, to drop in a little bit more of both of my colors in certain areas to make them look even more vibrant and push some darkest dark sections here and there before allowing this first layer to dry. Okay, so it's time to move on to working on the first layer of paint in the middle popsicle. And this is going to be a kind of a strawberry chocolate popsicle. And for the first time ever, I think in all of the watercolor painting tutorials that I've shared, you're going to be seeing me use a white. This is white watercolor, it's zinc white. I usually do not use white watercolor at all because it's really not even necessary. But because I really wanted to make this popsicle look creamy and milky, I'm going to be adding a little bit of this white into my quinacridone red. Right next to it, I am preparing some burnt umber with a little bit of water. And once again, I am making sure that these color mixtures are nice and juicy. I would say this is like 50% paint, 50% water. You definitely don't want your color mixtures to be super watered down because since we're using the pre-wetting technique, we're already going to have a certain amount of water content on that paper when you drop in your color. If I were painting on dry paper initially with that first layer of paint, I would definitely go in with a lighter, more translucent color because I know that if I were painting on dry paper, then that color, it's not going to dissipate out into that wetness. When it comes to developing those more translucent areas and those darker areas, it's important to just take into account the 3D structure of whatever it is that we are painting. Because that first popsicle has a rounded kind of cylindrical form to it, I knew that by creating those lighter, more translucent green values in the central part, I would make that part look a little bit more raised and more close to us as the viewer of the popsicle than the edges that I tried to darken a little bit more. Alright, so with my burnt umber plus watercolor mixture and my quinacridone red plus zinc white color mixture ready for me on my color mixing palette, I changed my water once again to make sure that I would be pre-wetting this shape with clean water. And again, I am taking my time with this pre-wetting, going over everything at least 3 to 4 times and making sure that I'm arriving at a nice even sheen all throughout this area. Cool, so once I had this shape nice and pre-wetted and a nice even sheen was developed all throughout, I started using this same paintbrush to start dropping in my pink. I started placing my color along the outer edges. And this is because I knew that at the end I was going to be pushing darker values along the edges to create a more rounded out look. And I was going to be developing lighter values for both of these colors in the central section. So I kind of always like starting by placing my color in the darkest areas first. Once I felt I had a good amount of color on my paper and I had certain little sections of paper shining through, I removed all of the color from my paintbrush bristles. I removed the excess water, create little gradients from darker pink into lighter pink. And once I was happy with the variation in pink values and translucencies, I allowed myself to drop in a little bit more pink only along the edges that I wanted to darken further. With the pink in, I then got started with dropping in the brown. And again, I started by dropping it into the outer edges, and the process was exactly the same. I dropped in the brown along the outer edges, maybe just a little bit in the central section, and once I felt I had a good amount of paint in there, I removed the color from my paintbrush bristles and I went back in to move that color around a tiny bit, mostly focusing on creating gradients from darker browns along the outer edges into lighter, more translucent browns as they made their way in. And once that was done, I then allowed myself to drop in a little bit more of that burnt umber, especially along the outer edges, to push the dark values in those areas further. Because my paper is still quite wet, it has not yet arrived at that awkward stage at which it's partially dry and I can't really do much work on it at all. I allowed myself to drop in a little bit more of my pink along the outer edges of this upper section as well. If you ever drop in way too much color, if you ever have like a little puddle somewhere in your popsicle, remember that you can always go in and use your paintbrush bristles as a little absorbent sponge, or also you can use your absorbent towel to do that lifting while that paint is still wet, and it's easily fixable. If you work relatively quickly and make sure that you're doing lifting or gentle moving around of that color while that paint is still wet, you can fix plenty of mistakes. But once your paint has arrived at that awkward drying state at which it's semi-dry, you shouldn't really be going in and doing any scrubbing of color or trying to add more paint on top of that if it's not completely dry, because that is going to lead to an overworked look. Now, if you did your pre-wetting well, and if you've been working relatively quickly, then your paper should still at this point be in a pretty wet state. And if it's not, this could be because of a few different things. The environment that you're working in really affects how your painting process is moving forward. If you have a fan on top of you, if you have the air conditioning on, if you have some sort of heating on, anything like that could really affect how quickly or how slowly your water and your paint dry on your watercolor paper. And of course, the paper that you're using also could have an impact on how quickly things are drying, how quickly that paint and water settle and is absorbed into your paper, and a bunch of things like that. So always consider those variables, because when we're painting with watercolors, so many different variables come into play. And these variables can affect both our painting process and also our final outcome could end up looking quite different because of these things. It's very, very important that you understand this pre-wetting technique and that you also get how helpful it can be, not only when it comes to creating soft transitions between colors and arriving at these beautiful organic watercolor effects, but also in just making things dry more slowly and providing us more time, more working time in which we can go in and drop in more color or do more moving around of that paint before things start to dry on us. If I had painted all of this on dry paper, when I placed that paint on my paper, they would start drying immediately. I would be left with hard edges around the shapes that I'm painting in. And when you're working on dry paper, the moving around of that paint that you do has to be done even more quickly and even more minimally, because the more moving around you do, the more overworked things will look at the end, the less fresh your outcome will tend to look. And overall, things tend to end up looking a lot lighter and glowier than when I just do all of my painting on dry paper. Okay, so I finished up with that first layer of paint in the middle popsicle. I changed my water once again before getting started with this third popsicle. And what I am doing right now is I am preparing my color mixtures for my third popsicle, and this one is going to use 3 different color mixtures. So I am preparing a yellow, an orange, and a red orange. My yellow is cadmium yellow medium with a bit of water in it. My orange is a color called Golden Deep with a little bit of water in it. And my red orange is a combination of Golden Deep plus Madder Lake Red Light. Notice once again how I created nice, juicy, yet saturated color mixtures. Alright, so with my color mixtures ready on my color mixing palette, it was time to remove all of that color from my paintbrush bristles and do my pre-wetting of this last popsicle. So using my size 6 round brush, you're seeing me go in to do this pre-wetting, going over everything at least 3 to 4 times and making sure that I arrive at a nice even sheen all throughout this popsicle shape. Now, you guessed it, the first color that I'm going to be dropping in once I finish with my pre-wetting is the yellow. I'm going to place my yellow sparingly, then I'm going to drop in some orange, and after that I'm going to be placing the red orange only in certain little spots. You can place a few more red spots than I am if you'd like, and they don't have to be in the exact same locations where mine are going to be. However, what I do want to mention about this popsicle that makes it different from the others that we've painted so far is I would consider this one to be slightly more complex because of the ridges throughout this popsicle, right? So we want to make sure that we're developing those values and those translucencies in a way that we are going to be able to describe those sections of this popsicle that are kind of going inwards a little bit. So after I've added in my initial yellow, you're gonna see how I actually start doing linear kind of vertical brush strokes along the pencil lines that I've created for myself with the orange after placing in some orange. And so you really don't have to go in and try to create perfect lines to describe those inwards sections. Really, a little bit goes a long way, and you can see me doing those strokes right here. So I'm using this orange to draw those more linear strokes along my pencil lines to help me enhance the look of those ridges without feeling the need to draw out those shapes, right? Or create perfect lines. And because I am creating these brush strokes on paper that is wet, and while that initial yellow layer is still wet, those lines look soft. They bleed out, they blur out into that wetness. So those lines are not stark looking, they're not too contrasting, and they're not too distracting because you are creating those strokes on paper that is wet. After I've added in some orange, and you can see how I've left sections in which that paper is shining through, almost completely unpainted, I started dropping in a little bit of my red orange. And for this one, I really had in mind those mango chili popsicles that I've seen around my city. So I really placed this red orange really sparingly here and there. Once I placed a little bit of this last color here and there, I removed all of the red orange from my paintbrush bristles and I went back in to do some gentle merging of this red orange into the previous colors by gently just running my paintbrush bristles, especially along the edges of those red-orange shapes. And you can see how I basically just merged these colors together right on my paper. Later on, I'm going to be placing a little bit more of the red-orange on top to strengthen and darken some sections of that red-orange amongst that larger red-orange shape. Okay, and right here, I switched on over to my smaller paintbrush. Once again, this is my size 2 round brush, and using a little bit of that orange, just the golden deep, the plain orange with a little bit of water in it, I am going back into doing those linear long brush strokes along my pencil lines, just to further enhance and darken some sections in those ridges along the popsicle before the paper starts to dry. Because the paper is still quite wet, I still have that soft look to these lines. With that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more of my reddish orange. And you're going to see me, as I said before, drop it in very sparingly, only into certain sections within those larger, soft red-orange shapes that I've already created, and also a little bit in certain segments along these orange lines that I've created to describe the ridges in this popsicle. You're going to notice how the red-orange really intensifies when I add this in and overlap it on a section of red-orange that I had already painted in, and it works to intensify that gradient look. You don't want to cover up that previous lighter red-orange value that you've already created, but only darken certain little spots within those larger shapes. Alright, so it was time to allow that to dry completely, and in the meantime, I'm going to be painting in the popsicle sticks. And for the popsicle sticks, I'm going to be using yellow ochre and burnt umber. So what I am doing right here is I am preparing a little puddle of yellow ochre plus a little bit of water, and a second little puddle of yellow ochre plus some burnt umber in another little well on my color mixing palette. So essentially you want a little bit of both in each. But just like what I was mentioning with the previous phase of this painting process, you want to make sure that there is a good difference between the two. You want a lighter brown and a darker brown so that you can at least create somewhat of a variety of different values and use at least 2 different browns in the popsicle sticks. So with my color mixers ready for my popsicle sticks, I switched on over to my size 2 round brush because these are very small, narrow areas. And I am going to be painting them in wet on dry. So this paper is completely dry. I have not done any pre-wetting. And I decided to paint them on dry paper because since these little shapes are so small, I wanted to make sure to have a greater control. And I also wanted to make sure that I was leaving little teeny tiny sections of white paper shining through completely unpainted so that I can create the illusion of little bright highlights even in the popsicle sticks. Okay, so initially I went in with the lighter brown. I painted that in, leaving those little teeny tiny specks of white paper unpainted. And then once that was done and while that paint was still wet, I dropped in a little bit of the darker brown, especially right along the bottom of the shape of the popsicle, where it would make sense that the mass, the volume of that popsicle would create a little bit of a cast shadow effect on the stick. This doesn't mean that you cannot add a little bit of the dark brown in some other areas, maybe along the edges of these very narrow shapes, but you definitely don't want that darker brown to start overtaking and completely covering up the lighter brown because If it does happen, then what's the point of having created the two different browns, right? So make sure that at the end, you have sections in which you have lighter brown visible and other sections where you have the darker brown and little tiny highlights, and maybe other sections where your browns are more translucent. Along the way, as I am painting in these very small shapes, I am constantly staying on top of water control as best as I can, touching just the tip of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel and making sure that I'm not going in with way too much paint or way too much water. And in cases in which I accidentally place way too much paint or water in this area, I go in and do some quick lifting with either my absorbent towel very carefully or the bristles of my paintbrush. Use those bristles as a little absorbent sponge to pick up that excess paint and water, and then I continue doing whatever work it is that I am doing. Okay, so it's time to allow that first layer of paint in the sticks to dry. And what I am doing right now is I am creating a gray for myself. So instead of reaching for something like a Payne's gray or a ready-made black and just watering it down to get a gray, what I like doing is I like creating my own dark, rich, vibrant grays, which really look like blacks when they're at their most saturated state. And by mixing together a dark blue, like an ultramarine blue, and a dark brown, like a burnt umber or even a burnt sienna, you can definitely get very rich, dark, vibrant grays. Now, when you create your own color mixtures, it's important to test out your color mixtures and do any shifting and modifying of those ratios in your color mixtures until you arrive at the color that you need. Once you have your gray, you're going to add some water into it because you don't want to go in to paint in these cast shadows in a very dark, saturated way. Notice how light and how translucent it looks on my paper. I am using my size 6 round brush and painting in a cast shadow shape on the right of all of these popsicles with my translucent gray. And you can go over it a couple of times, 3 times even, to make sure that it remains wet, because what you're gonna do is you're gonna drop in the colors that you actually use to paint in that popsicle. Just drop it into certain little sections along the edge of your popsicle and the edge of this cast shadow shape here and there. And this is going to create a beautiful kind of effect in which that popsicle is perhaps melting, or it could also create the effect of these popsicles being on some sort of smooth reflective surface that is kind of bouncing the colors from those popsicles back up. Make sure that when you're dropping in those colors of those popsicles on your gray, that you're dropping it into the edge closest to the popsicle. Whatever the case may be, and however you decide to see these, it really helps integrate the popsicle with the cast shadow. Repeating that color or using that color that you actually use to paint the popsicle in the cast shadow, it gives the shadow more interest as opposed to just leaving it plain gray, and it creates an integration and a nice harmony between the actual subject and the cast shadow alongside that edge. Right here, I moved on to doing the exact same process for the chocolate strawberry popsicle. Getting started with my light watered down gray that I created by mixing together ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And then while that light gray layer was still wet, I dropped in some pink along the top and some brown along the bottom. I'm working on the last one right here, doing the exact same thing. First, working on painting in that cast shadow shape with my translucent gray, going over that shape at least a couple of times, 3 times, to make sure that that gray is nice and wet before I drop in the colors of the popsicle in some little sections here and there. Alrighty, so I am all done with the cast shadows It is time to allow everything to dry completely, and we're going to get to work on the second layer of wet on wet in the popsicles. And the objective with the second layer of wet on wet is just going to be to darken certain areas further and not to cover up lighter value areas. So we're really just trying to give these popsicles a little bit more dimension, darken certain areas, and maybe just create certain little details here and there. Right here, what I am doing is I am creating a little bit more of my lighter green and my darker green. So these color mixtures were created with my cadmium lemon and my green. My lighter green has, the majority of it is lemon yellow. It has a tiny bit of that green, and the darker green has much more of the green in it and just a tiny bit of lemon yellow. And exactly the same way that I did in the beginning when I was first creating these color mixtures, I'm making sure that these mixes are nice and juicy and they have a good amount of color in them, but also a bit of water, so there's a good amount of movement going on in those wells on my color mixing palette. Alright, so once I have a good amount of each color prepared there in those wells, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I'm going in with my size 6 round brush once again and using clean water to very, very gently, for the second time, pre-wet this entire popsicle shape. When you're using this technique in which you're once again pre-wetting a shape that you've already painted in, you want to be even more gentle than you were before, because you certainly don't want to start moving that beautiful color in those values that you've already developed around. And you can do that if you start scrubbing way too much. Watercolor can certainly be reactivated and even gently scrubbed and lifted even after it has dried. And it also depends a lot on the specific pigments that you're using, because some pigments are way more staining than others, and also the specific type of paper that you're working on. Some papers really absorb that color and won't let it budge, while others, you can very, very easily reactivate that color and color starts moving around like crazy. So be nice and gentle and just do very gentle pre-wetting until you arrive at a nice even sheen. And then what you're going to be doing is you start with your lighter green, you drop it into certain sections that you want to push those colors and those values in, especially once again along the edges of the popsicle so that you can really round out that cylindrical shape. You don't really want to add in more color, especially not the darker green in the middle section of the popsicle, because you want that middle section to only have lighter values, right? After you've placed some lighter green, you can go ahead and start dropping in more of your darker green along some of those sections of those edges. So as you can see, I am really doing my best to stay away from the middle section, and I'm just trying to push the darker values mostly along the edges to round out the cylindrical form a little bit more. So the objective with the second layer of paint is not to completely cover up the previous layer, but to just darken certain sections and allow that previous layer, which has the lighter values, to completely shine through the lighter value areas that we're looking to develop. We can also intensify some colors and play around with gradients a little bit more, as long as we don't have that color or more saturated color bleed into the middle section of this popsicle. Right here, I switched on over to my smaller round brush, and I am using this round brush to darken certain sections a little bit more, and I'm going to be creating tiny little imperfections here and there throughout the popsicle. You can see how I've added a little tiny linear stroke along the bottom left edge of that popsicle to just add a few more imperfections and make this look a little bit more realistic. By this point, the paint is still pretty wet, so I have a little bit more working time, and you can see how that stroke that I added in, it was nice and blurred out, and it looks soft because that color dissipated out into that wetness. Now, even though I am mostly sticking to darkening and placing more color in the outer edges, I want you to notice how I'm really making sure to keep everything quite irregular And I'm not creating any specific patterns or outlines along the edges of this popsicle or anything like that. And we really want to stay away from that kind of thing because that tends to flatten things out. We don't have outlines around the things that we see in real life. So can flatten things out and make them look a little bit too cartoony. Okay, so while that green dries, I am going to be darkening certain areas in the popsicle stick. And I'm just going in on dry paper and I am using my darker brown. So this is burnt umber with a little bit of water in it. And I am just using my smaller round brush to push some darker brown values, especially in the upper section of the stick. Now, be very, very careful because if the greens that are right along the popsicle stick are not yet dry and you start painting in the brown, what's going to happen is that the green is going to start bleeding into the popsicle stick. So be very, very careful. You can either allow the greens to dry completely and paint the popsicle stick later, or you can just make sure that you are leaving a teeny tiny sliver of dry paper in between the greens and the new brown shape that you're painting in. All right, so once I was done with the popsicle stick, I changed my water once again because I definitely didn't want to have any green in my paintbrush when I did my pre-wetting on this next popsicle. And the process is going to be exactly the same. I am using my larger round brush, my size 6, to very, very gently do my pre-wetting once again using this clean water all over this new popsicle shape. And after I've arrived at a nice even sheen all throughout the popsicle, I am going to be dropping in the same 2 color mixtures, only this time my quinacridone red plus zinc white color mixture has a very small amount of white in it, so it looks quite darker than it looked before when it had more white. And the brown in the bottom is just the plain burnt umber with a bit of water in it. I once again got started with my lightest color of the 2, which is my pink. And then I moved on to my brown, focusing mostly on adding in this new layer of paint in the outer edges of the popsicle so that I can create a nice rounded out look. This said, once again, I really wanted to have irregularity and imperfection in mind and really stay away from creating an even shape or outline around the edges of the popsicle. So I did allow myself to bring in a little bit of color in some sections, going a little bit inward, so to speak. And you can see me add in a few shapes and marks in just a bit. I'm also going to be switching to my smaller round brush once again to add some little lines and marks here and there, some little imperfections to make things look a little bit more natural. I'm making sure to work fast while this paint is still wet so that I can have nice soft transitions and a nice blurred out effect so that nothing is too stark looking or distracting for the viewer at the end. If you find yourself accidentally placing way too much color, or you create a little effect that you don't like or a mark that you don't like or anything like that, just remove the color from your paintbrush bristles and smooth out that mark or that shape or those edges or whatever that may be. Just make sure that you're working while that paint is still wet. And remember that you can always help yourself. Do some lifting with your absorbent towel or the clean and slightly damp bristles of your paintbrush. Use them as a little absorbent sponge to create a little bit more dimension, lift up some excess paint and water from your painting. Right here, I am using this smaller round brush to darken some sections in the popsicle stick. Okay, so I'm almost done with the second popsicle and it's going to be time to allow it to dry and move on to working on exactly the same things on the last one. So right here, you can see me prepare a little bit more of my yellow and I'm making sure that I have enough orange and the red orange as well on my color mixing palette before getting started. And finally, I am doing my pre-wetting super gently using my larger round brush. And once I've arrived at a nice even sheen all throughout, I'm gonna get started once again with the lightest color of the bunch, which is my yellow. I'm going to drop it into certain sections, and then I'm going to go ahead and get started with the orange. And finally, I am going to be moving on to the darkest color of the bunch, which is the red orange. Now, remember, the objective, the intention with the second layer of paint is just to intensify certain colors, maybe improve some gradients here and there, and also to darken darkest value areas, but we're not looking to cover up highlights or areas of lightest values. We want to leave those uncovered. So it's important that we drop in a little bit of color at a time. And once we feel we've placed enough color, you remove the color from your paintbrush bristles and you go back in, if needed, to do some very gentle moving around of that color. And just remember, less is more. The less moving around of the color you do, the fresher and less overworked the results will be. So I am pushing some darker values along the edges of those ridges here and there, but just like what I was mentioning before, I don't want to have these shapes of these ridges super drawn out or super perfect, because that's not going to look very natural. So really only darken certain sections along the lines of those ridges or the shapes that you've created with your pencil initially for those ridges. Keep everything very irregular and very loose. Right here, I'm doing very gentle moving it around of that paint with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush. And finally, I'm going to be pushing some little sections of my red orange. So I'm going to be dropping in just a minimal amount of this red in those sections of red orange that I had already developed, just to push little sections inside of that larger red orange shape. Okay, so I decided to darken some sections of those edges of those ridges a little bit more with my orange. And in just a bit, I'm gonna be switching finally to my smaller round brush to add in some minor details and imperfections. Everything is still quite wet at this point, so all of the little details and shapes that I'm adding in are bleeding and blurring out still. You can see those nice, soft, diffused out, wet on wet edges. And as your paper starts to dry, you're gonna notice that your shapes, lines, marks that you're painting in, they diffuse out less and less. And this is completely normal. The more you practice with watercolor, the easier it's gonna be for you to tell when your paper has arrived at that awkward, partially dry, partially damp state at which you really shouldn't be doing much of anything at all. Whenever my paper arrives at that state, I know that it's time to allow that layer of paint to dry. And if I want to add any further detail or darken certain sections, I'm going to have to approach it in a whole different layer. With these last little details that I added in, you can see how, yes, I have a slightly blurred effect, but that paint is not expanding out as much as it was before, and this is because my paper is starting to dry. Okay, and now I am just finishing up with darkening certain sections of that popsicle stick, and I'll be all done. Alright, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!